Lessons from Harvey and Letha Staheli, and is presented by Lynn Staheli at the Staheli Family Reunion in 2016. Originally, the Stahelis came to southern Utah being sent by Brigham Young because of their musical skills, and he was hoping that they would develop a band in southern Utah which would expand the scope of their work. And Dad's parents came as children. Dad was George Staheli, who died at 80, and Emma Staheli, who died at 69. And they were sent to Santa Clara in a very poor situation, very poor community. And Dad had several siblings. His wife had three husbands, and the last husband was George, who had Grace and Lorraine and Dad. And then the previous husband was Fordham, who had Eugene and Carl. I knew Eugene and Carl briefly. Eugene was an excellent, successful businessman. Carl was a musician, but did a variety of things throughout his life. Dad's siblings, Grace, lived in a place where we saw her with her kids and the cousins. And Lorraine Staheli died, unfortunately, in an automobile accident where he suffered an injury to his knee and then bled to death on the way to the hospital, which was really very tragic, very much a loss. The gentleman on the far right, of course, is Dad, and the next to him was Carl Staheli, who we sort of met late in life. Dad grew up in Santa Clara. As a child, he did a lot of different things, like he trapped animals for their fur that he could sell, and also for the bounty that was provided for predators like coyotes. He peddled fruit. He was briefly a miner. He was a barber, a salesman, a carpenter that was excellent in terms of his capabilities. He was a farmer, and also, most importantly, he was an educator. And he did this variety of jobs that I think gave him a very unique, very colorful, very broad experienced youth. Mother's parents were the Taylors, and they came from P.G. Taylor, who had a lot of children. He had 36 children and four wives, and they lived in southern Utah in St. George. And Kent and I had the opportunity to spend a month with them while our parents were visiting Mexico traveling. And they had a small farm, and it was very interesting to learn how they dealt with things. Mother's siblings were shown here, and Mother had the pigtails on the next to the third from the right, and she had a fairly normal childhood. And in the 1920s, she was a young woman who was very charismatic and very smart, had a lot of friends, as shown here in these pictures. She was also very accomplished, and for example, she was awarded the Dixie College winner of the Washington Birthday Oratorical Contest, and this was a note from Edgar Jensen, who was the president of the university at the time. And these are pictures of the kids at the time when she was in school. Harvey and Letha got together as they had many common interests. You see Harvey there as shown on the left, and Letha and on the right. And they were married, and then they moved to Provo because Dad got a job as a teacher, later became principal, and so Provo became their home. This is a picture taken from the BYU campus showing the empty foothills, which is true years ago when they were around. One of the first things they did was to remodel a house, and they bought this old house on the upper right and remodeled it into a very nice home. It had a red roof and a beautiful walnut tree in front and white painted siding, and had central heating, which was really unique for its time, and lived in really very good downtown Provo, about a block from the lower campus BYU. At that time, it was during the Depression, and people lived very frugally, and we didn't have really very much. For instance, I had this wagon, it's shown in the upper right, which I used to sell things, put corn in and sell things, and also pull around the community. People hunted for their meat, for venison, and bottled and canned fruits and vegetables at home. And we had simple things like a single radio, where we listened to Jack Armstrong, the Lone Ranger. And Provo is an ideal place for children. As shown on the left-hand side, Ken and Lynn, and then their cousins of the Taylors from St. George, and at different ages shown with the parents and in front of our home in the car. Dogs were important to us, and I think that still carries through today, and maybe that's where it's got its origin. I had 3 dogs that I followed around all day. I spent a lot of days shooting things with my flipper as shown around my neck, and dogs were a very important part. Toby was probably most important, as shown in the upper right. And we lived in a community that was very healthy for children to grow up in. And Provo at the time only had about 25,000 people. Now I think it's 10 times that large or more. And we had this home, which is sort of downtown area. And if you look at our home in the center of it, and you look at the red circle, that's about a block, city block, Provo city block. And it was interesting to see who lived in this neighborhood. Next door was a barber, and across the street was the banker. The neighbor on the left was the architect. The woman on the right had a boarding house. A block or so away was a seminary teacher, the superintendent of schools, the bishop, quite a few teachers, so forth. So it was a very egalitarian type of community, very equal. And the kids that grew up in that situation did really pretty well. You know, they had the upward mobility that was the American dream. And Jim Rawlings, for instance, who was the son of the barber next door, became an attorney who was very successful. Union Carbide, one of their chief executive officers, and was also the ambassador to Zimbabwe. And then the Oaks family. Dallin Oaks became a high-level member of the Mormon Church, and Robert Oaks was from several doors down, became a 4-star general and is very, very highly regarded. So it was a very unique situation. The family always valued education. And remember in 1938 when I was about 5 and sitting on the floor and going through the commencement, and Dad was getting a master's degree and Mother a BA degree at the same time. And at that time also there were a lot of public works projects. They were called WPA projects from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's program of putting people to work. So millions of people were put to work, increasing the quality of the infrastructure of the United States, doing it at a very reasonable price. So there were curbs, irrigation ditches, wilderness projects. We had a new power plant in Seattle, or in Provo. There were schools. The Timpanogos School is shown here, where Dad was principal, and the walking school across town where Kent and I went to school were typical examples of that. So the infrastructure was really improved by these projects. And Dad was a very successful member of the educational community, and at that time they were very highly regarded, and we kind of had average pay, very much different than today. He was president of the Utah Education Association Principals Group and had the ability to really deal with children so well. He dealt with children extremely effectively. Mother was a social worker. She was recruited during World War II for work in that field, and she became aware of the problems of the poor and was considered by her boss to be the best of her social workers. And that interest in the poor and the underserved continued on for her lifetime. There were many other experiences in Provo at that time. One of the unique things that happened was that just a couple of years after the end of World War II, Dad applied and was accepted as an exchange student to England, which was a risky thing and expensive at the time. It was kind of unheard of. This was just right after the war, and we were originally going to be sent to a small town, but later was changed, fortunately, to Wimbledon, which is just outside of London. So this was our passport picture on the lower left side. And then we, Dad and Mother, put all our belongings into a trailer and put it on the car, drove across the United States, secured the car for a year, and then we transed the Atlantic on the so-called Marine Tiger, which is a converted World War II trip. It took 10 days. It was a very interesting experience. And then this year was really transformative. We changed a lot in terms of our size and also in our thinking and our visual view of the world. And Dad had lots of experiences, as did Mother. This is Mother and Dad when they were visiting with their headmaster of the school that he was working at. And they learned certain things. The British were very snobby in a way. For example, You didn't want to tell anybody that you'd been a minor because they kind of looked down upon that. And certainly was true with being a Mormon. Mormons were considered really be despicable people. So you had to be a little bit careful about who you told what. We also got care packages from home. You see how beat up the cans and bottles are. And we learned to live with less. This was during a period of intense rationing in the UK or England. Also, Dad got very much enamored with the Manchester Guardian, a newspaper, as both parents were very focused on the world events and what was happening elsewhere. And this paper now has gotten rid of the name Manchester, so it's called The Guardian. And I read it every day. It's on my website, and I think it's the best source of unbiased information that I can find. And also provided a world's perspective. And I think this world perspective led the parents on to thinking about things differently. For example, Dad was very much an opponent to the Vietnam War. He felt that was a terrible error, and he was, of course, absolutely right. It was. And Mother was very adamant about not being an isolationist, but being concerned about people of the world and staying out of other people's problems and business, and probably something we should learn today. Dad's car care was really impressive. He always bought a car every year from the Studebaker model, because Gene Fordham was had the franchise for Salt Lake City, and we had this car in 1941, and then a Dodge Dart, each of which were kept for about 30 years. And Dad was adamant about servicing these cars every 1,000 miles, and they lasted forever because of that excellent care they received. Ken and I both were married. Well, I think under good decisions, and we accepted our families and blended well. And Mother continued, as we talked about, being interested in education, and we got a master's degree at 55 at the University of Utah. She went up every morning to go to school, or several times a week at least, and would come and would do the commuting to attend these classes. And I was fortunate in getting in the top 10 of my class, but she actually was the top person in her class when we graduated together from the University of Utah in 1955, or 59 rather. After their retirement, they did a lot of traveling, because traveling kind of got into the blood of the families, and particularly the parents. And they traveled to China, which was one of the first Westerners to go there, and were sort of really, people would want to touch them and see them. They couldn't hardly believe there were white people like that. They went to the Near East, to Morocco, to Europe, to Asia, and so forth. And they felt that family was increasingly important as they got to be older. And they also used old age to pursue their talents. For instance, Dad had talents, many, many talents. He was an excellent singer, sang leads in operas at BYU, and also had a wonderful penmanship, and also a great painter. And he spent much of his days painting and creating scores of pictures, which were exhibited. This is an exhibit, one of his exhibits in Provo, Utah, of friends coming and having all his paintings being distributed. This is what Mother was very much focused on the world, and she said when she got to be older, well, when I die, I'm going to really miss what's going on in the world. I've always keep track of it, and knowing what's going to happen is very important to me. And Mother said in her old age that she regretted a few things. One was that Harvey should have been a physician, she should have been a history professor, and they should have shot a little bit higher. Although I'm impressed with how high they came, how much they advanced from being in really abject poverty in southern Utah to being respected professional members of the Provo community. And I think Ken and I both became physicians, but I think that they really made more headway than we did, considering where they started. And we learned a lot of lessons from the parents. And I think for mothers, particularly on philosophical lessons. And one of the things she repeated over and over again was how important diversity was. We should value diversity. And that it was really important to take care of the poor. And she was really appalled by killing animals for sport, hurting and killing animals just for fun. She couldn't tolerate in her philosophical way. And knowing current events. And sometimes these family values transcend that. For example, below on our global health organization which we established. One of the principles is, on the mission statement, is that HELP is a humanitarian organization that is non-political and values racial, cultural, and religious diversity. I think relating back to Mother's philosophy about valuing diversity. On the other hand, Dad was very practical. He had so many different experiences, and he was really focused on working, and he wanted to teach his boys how to work. And Ken and I think, started when we were children, selling things. And I remember pulling weeds when I was 5 and getting a dime a day. And he also had a lot of practical kind of recommendations, like do things when you think about it, and also to know the big picture. And lessons from both parents was that education was very important. To live frugally, so you could always have enough for important things. For example, our medical schools were covered by them. Gain a world perspective and travel at every opportunity. And we've continued that since that time, and keeping up with world events. Well, I thank you for listening.